This is my true story. I spent 50 years building a life and a business so my son would never struggle. I thought I'd raised a son who valued family. But one afternoon, I called just to say hello. He answered on speakerphone, his friends laughing in the background, and said, "Stop calling." Then he hung up before I could reply. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I stayed silent. But he didn't know. I still had the power to take back what he thought was his. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from. And please subscribe so that my story can reach to more people. I was not born with much. My childhood was nothing more than a small rented room, a second-hand coat that was too big for me, and the constant sound of my father's tired cough after working 12-hour shifts. I promised myself that when I grew up, my own family would never live like that. So, from the moment I was old enough to work, I worked. I was 16 when I took my first job sweeping floors in a hardware store, and I was 19 when I saved enough money to buy my first set of tools. They weren't much, a hammer, a drill, a few screwdrivers. But they were mine. I treated those tools better than I treated myself, because I knew they could build me a future. Over the years, I took any job I could get my hands on: construction, repair work, night shifts at factories. I didn't see weekends the way most people do. Weekends weren't for rest. They were for catching up on bills or finishing side jobs to make extra money. Every blister on my hand felt like an investment in a life I wanted to give my family. When I married my wife, I told her one thing: we might not have much now, but one day you'll never have to worry. And I meant it. We had our son 2 years later, and I can still remember holding him for the first time. He was so small, so fragile, his whole body fitting into my forearm. I swore I would protect him from everything: the cold, the hunger, the fear I grew up with. From that moment on, every single decision I made was about giving him the best life possible. I worked overtime when he was a baby to make sure my wife could stay home and care for him. I skipped meals so there would be more food on the table for him. I patched my old boots instead of buying new ones so we could afford his school fees later. And I didn't complain. Not once. Years passed, and I began to dream bigger. I didn't want to just work for someone else forever. I wanted something that would be mine, something I could pass down. That dream became reality the day I opened my own business. It wasn't a grand opening with balloons or music. It was just me, a rented workshop, and a sign I'd painted myself. The first few months were hard. Some days I'd work 12, 14, even 16 hours just to make enough to pay rent and keep the lights on. But slowly, things changed. I gained customers. People started recommending me. My work spoke for itself. And before I knew it, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something real. I ran that business for decades. I poured my soul into it. I knew every customer's name, every order, every problem that needed fixing. I didn't cut corners. I didn't cheat people. That business became my second home, and it provided for everything we needed. It paid for our house. It paid for my son's education. It gave us family vacations, small ones, but meaningful. And as my son grew older, I taught him everything I knew. I brought him into the shop when he was still in school, showed him how to work the tools, how to speak to customers, how to solve problems without losing your temper. I told him, one day, this will be yours, but you have to earn it. And I believed he would. When he went to college, I helped pay for it, even when it meant I had to take on more jobs at night. I didn't want him to graduate with debt. I wanted him to start his adult life with a clean slate. After college, he came back home, and I gave him a place in the business. I didn't put him in the back to sweep floors. I made him my right-hand man. I introduced him to all my clients, taught him about the suppliers, showed him the bookkeeping. I wanted him to know everything, because one day, I planned to step back and let him run it entirely. All those years, I thought our bond was unbreakable. We worked side by side. We shared lunches in the same office I'd sat in for decades. I thought he saw the sweat, the years, the sacrifice. I thought he understood. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe he saw the business as something that just existed, something that was handed to him instead of something built from nothing. Maybe he didn't see the nights I came home too tired to eat, or the winters where my hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, or the countless moments where I put his needs above my own. Still, I never doubted him. I always thought, he's my son. Blood is blood. He'll take care of me when I'm older. I didn't need riches. I didn't need gifts. I just wanted respect. I wanted a phone call now and then to ask how I was doing. I wanted to know that if I needed help, I could count on him the way he had always counted on me. But as I would later learn, years of sacrifice don't guarantee years of gratitude. Sometimes, the more you give, the more people take, until they forget you ever gave at all. By the time I reached my late 60s, my body had started to slow down, but my mind was still sharp. I could still walk into that shop and tell you exactly where every tool, every bolt, and every order was without looking at a list. But my knees ached, my back protested when I bent too long, and some mornings it took me an hour just to get moving. I wasn't the same man who could work from sunrise to midnight anymore. I knew I had to start thinking about the future, and in my mind, there was never a question about who that future belonged to. It was my son. Always my son. I had built everything with the idea that one day he would take the keys from my hands and carry it forward. I didn't want to sell it to strangers. I didn't want it to vanish when I was gone. I wanted it to stay in the family, as a legacy. I remember the day I told him I was ready to step back. It wasn't an emotional speech or a grand announcement. We were sitting in the office, a stack of invoices between us, the smell of machine oil in the air. I looked at him and said, "I think it's time. You've learned everything you need to know. From now on, this place is yours to run." I expected a smile, maybe even a hug. Instead, he just nodded, almost like it was no surprise. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just processing. I told myself he was probably overwhelmed. We went to the lawyer's office the following week. I signed the documents that transferred day-to-day control to him, but I kept a portion of ownership, not because I didn't trust him, but because it was smart business to keep some oversight in case something went wrong. I didn't think it ever would, but after a lifetime of working, you learn to keep a safety net. He didn't question it. I told him, "This is your future. Take care of it like you would take care of family." He looked me in the eye and said, "Of course, Dad." Those words meant something to me. I believed them. For the first few months after handing it over, I still came by the shop a few days a week. Not to interfere, just to be there if he needed advice. I stayed in the background, letting him deal with customers, suppliers, and staff. I thought it was important for him to build his own authority. When he did ask for help, I was there instantly. If a supplier gave him trouble, I'd make the call. If a customer was unhappy, I'd handle the situation. I thought we were still a team, even if I was letting him lead. I also gave him something I never had when I started. A debt-free business. No loans, no unpaid bills, no overdue rent. Every machine was paid for, every account in good standing. He was stepping into a position most people could only dream of. And I was proud of that. Proud that I could give him a foundation I never had. But even in those early months, I noticed small changes. He didn't ask me to lunch as often. The conversations we had used to be about the future, about plans and dreams. Now they were short, about sales numbers or delivery delays. When I called, sometimes he wouldn't pick up right away. Sometimes hours would pass before he returned my call. I brushed it off at first, told myself he was busy. I knew running the business could be demanding. I'd lived that life for decades, so I understood. Still, there was something different in his tone, a kind of impatience that hadn't been there before. If I gave advice, he'd listen, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't really want it. He thought he had it all figured out. I remembered when I was young and thought I knew everything too. I hoped it was just that, the arrogance of youth, something that would fade with time. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me missed being needed. When you've spent your whole life providing, guiding, and fixing problems, it's hard to suddenly step back and be told, "We've got it from here." I wanted him to succeed, But I also wanted him to remember that the reason he had this success was because I had carried it on my back for years before he ever set foot in the office. I kept telling myself, he's my son. He'll remember. But with every passing week, I felt that memory slipping from him. The respect, the gratitude. It was quieter now, almost invisible. Looking back, I think that was the start of the distance between us. Not a fight, not a betrayal in one sudden moment. Just a slow drifting apart, the kind that creeps up on you until you wake up one day and realize you're speaking to someone who no longer sees you as the man who built their world, just as someone who's in the background of it. At first, I told myself nothing was wrong. Families go through seasons. Sometimes you're close. Sometimes life pulls you in different directions. But the weeks after I stepped back from the business had a different feeling. It wasn't just that my son and I weren't talking as much. It was the tone, the weight behind every word, the way conversations ended faster than they started. The shop had always been our common ground, a place where we spoke the same language, where every decision was made shoulder to shoulder. Now, it was like that ground had shifted, and I was standing just outside the door, looking in through the glass. I'd call sometimes just to see how the week was going. Not to interfere, not to give advice unless asked, just a father checking in. The phone would ring and eventually go to voicemail. He'd send a short text back hours later. Busy right now. I'll call later. But later didn't always come. I'd end up waiting by the phone until bedtime, telling myself he must have been too tired to talk, that maybe tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow would come, and nothing would change. The visits to the shop grew fewer too. When I did drop by, the welcome was different. No big smile, no, "Hey Dad, you made it." Sometimes he barely looked up from his desk, tapping at his computer like I was just another supplier here to waste his time. If I lingered too long, I'd catch that subtle glance toward the clock, as if my presence was something that needed to be managed, like a meeting that had run too long. The conversations we did have felt transactional. We had a good week. Orders coming in late. Employee quit. No warmth, no stories, no asking how I was doing, if my knees were holding up, if I'd eaten lunch yet. It was strange, feeling like a stranger to someone whose first steps I'd once caught in my own arms. I noticed other changes too. He stopped inviting me to family dinners as often. Holidays, which used to be loud and messy with laughter, became smaller for me. Sometimes I'd find out after the fact that they'd hosted friends or gone out somewhere without telling me. I'd see photos on social media, his wife smiling, the kids laughing, and realize I hadn't even been thought of. Or worse, maybe I had been thought of and deliberately left out. One time, I overheard something that stayed with me. I was in the shop's back office looking for an old ledger when I heard my son out front talking to one of his friends. They were joking about old-timers who can't keep up with modern business. His friend laughed, and then I heard my son's voice say, "Yeah, my dad still thinks this is the 80s. If I ran things his way, we'd be out of business by now." They both laughed. I stood there, my hand on the ledger, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't just disrespect. It was erasure. As if the decades I'd spent building this from the ground up meant nothing now that he was in charge. As if I was a relic to be politely ignored until I faded away. Still, I bit my tongue. I told myself that pride makes people say things they don't mean. I told myself that maybe he felt pressure I couldn't see, that maybe his coldness was just stress. I tried not to take it personally, but it's hard not to when the person treating you this way is your own flesh and blood. The calls from him became rare, and when they did come, they were almost always about something he needed. A contact for a supplier, advice on an issue with the city inspector, help smoothing over a customer complaint. I gave him what he needed every time. No hesitation, no lecture, because that's what a father does, even when the respect you're given back feels like scraps. I remember one Sunday, I decided to stop by his house. I had a box of old family photos, pictures of him as a boy, of his mother smiling in the kitchen, of the shop in its first year. and I thought maybe we could go through them together. When I knocked, my grandson opened the door, surprised to see me. My son was in the kitchen, but when he saw me, his face barely moved. No smile, no warmth. I explained about the photos, but he just said, "Can you leave them? I'm busy right now." I left the box on the table and walked out. As I was leaving, I heard laughter from the backyard. A group of friends were there, music playing, the smell of barbecue in the air. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even been told it was happening. I stood at my car for a moment, looking back, wondering how I'd gone from being at the center of his life to standing outside it, completely invisible. That was when the truth began to settle in. The relationship wasn't just changing. It was disappearing. And I wasn't sure if he even cared. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky is flat and gray, and the air feels heavy without reason. I'd spent the morning in my small garden, pulling weeds and checking the tomato plants, thinking maybe I'd cook a little pasta that night and bring some over to my son. Cooking for him had always been my way of saying I love you without needing the words. I thought maybe that would be my chance to see him, to sit down and talk without it feeling like a business transaction. Before heading inside, I decided to call him first, just to check if they'd be home. I sat down in my old armchair, the one by the window, picked up my phone, and dialed. It rang longer than usual before he finally answered. His voice was flat, impatient. "Yeah? Hey, son," I said, smiling like he could somehow hear it in my tone. "I was thinking about making some pasta tonight. Thought I might bring you a plate. How's your day going?" There was a pause. Not the kind of pause where someone is smiling, thinking what to say next. No, this was the kind that stretches out like a shadow, carrying with it a weight you can already feel in your stomach. Then he sighed. "Dad. Look, I'm gonna say this straight because I don't have time for games. Stop calling." At first, I didn't quite process it. I thought maybe he meant stop calling about the business or stop calling during the workday, but his tone, sharp, dismissive, told me exactly what he meant. Stop calling him. Stop calling, period. I felt something inside me go still, like the world had pressed pause. My mind replayed the words in slow motion, each one heavier than the last. Stop calling. He must have felt the silence on my end because he kept going. "You're always checking in, always asking questions. I've got a lot going on, Dad. I need space, I'll reach out if I need something, okay?" If I need something. Not if I miss you, not if I want to talk. If I need something. Like I was no longer his father, but a dusty tool in the shed, taken out only when useful, shoved back into the dark when not. I could have argued. I could have told him about the nights I stayed up fixing his broken toys, about the mornings I skipped breakfast so he could have a full lunch at school, about the decades I worked with my hands bleeding to keep our family safe and fed. I could have told him that no father should ever have to ask permission to talk to his own son, but I didn't say any of that. I just sat there in my chair, the phone warm against my ear, and listened to him breathe on the other end. My hands were steady, my voice calm when I finally said, "All right. I understand." We hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time afterward, the silence in the room feeling heavier than it ever had. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, but inside, nothing moved. The clock ticked. My heart didn't race. It slowed, as if my body already knew what my mind was only starting to realize. I looked across the room at the framed photograph on the wall, the two of us on the day the shop first opened. He was just a boy in that picture, grinning ear to ear, his small hands clutching a ribbon we'd cut together. I remembered telling him that day, "One day this will be yours," and it had been his, until that moment. I thought of all the times I'd defended him when others doubted his work ethic, of all the loans I quietly paid off so his credit would stay clean, of all the nights I lay awake worrying about his stress, thinking I should do more to help, even when it meant sacrificing my own comfort. Now, he couldn't even stomach the sound of my voice. I knew then that something had broken, not in anger, not even in disappointment, but in clarity. The kind of break that doesn't happen in a single instant, but comes after years of small cracks, each one ignored until the structure finally gives way. I didn't cry. My chest felt hollow, like the wind could blow right through me, but I didn't cry. There's a point where sadness turns to something colder, something sharper. That's where I was now. The pasta idea was gone. Instead, I stood up, turned off the stove, and sat back down in my chair. I watched the light fade from the window, my hands folded in my lap, and I thought, really thought, about what my son had just told me. He wanted space. He wanted distance. And maybe, just maybe, I'd give him exactly what he asked for. But not in the way he imagined. That night, the house felt like a stranger's. I moved from room to room, touching objects I'd owned for decades. The wooden desk I'd built by hand, the clock that had hung in the same spot since before my son was born, the photographs in their fading frames, and every single one felt heavier than usual, as if each carried the weight of a question I didn't want to answer. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't read. I didn't even make tea. I just sat in the armchair by the window, the one that still had the faint smell of sawdust from years of me coming in after work and collapsing there with aching legs. Outside, the street was quiet except for the occasional car. Inside, the silence had teeth. It bit at the edges of my thoughts until there was only one thing left to think about. His words. Stop calling. It's strange how 4 syllables can rearrange your understanding of an entire lifetime. I thought about the years when my son was small, when a single scrape on his knee could bring him running into my arms, trusting me to fix anything. Back then, my voice was comfort, not intrusion. My calls, whether across the yard or from across town, were the sound of home. Somewhere along the line, that had changed. Not suddenly, not violently, but slowly, like a rope fraying strand by strand. I'd ignored the signs, the rushed conversations, the birthdays that turned into quick handshakes instead of long dinners, the way his face tightened whenever I asked too many questions about his life. I told myself it was normal, that sons grow up, get busy, have their own worlds to run. I told myself the distance was just life. But tonight, in the quiet, I stopped telling myself those things. Tonight, I admitted the truth. He didn't want me in his life unless I was giving him something. And the cruelest part? I'd given him more than anyone else ever had. I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting on my knees, and let the memories come. The early mornings in the shop, the sound of the metal shutters rattling up, the smell of coffee brewing before sunrise. I saw myself teaching him how to balance the books, how to negotiate a deal, how to shake a man's hand with enough firmness to mean business, but enough warmth to mean trust. I remembered the pride on his face the first time he made a big sale on his own. I remembered thinking, he's ready. He can do this. And I'd believed it so much that I signed over almost everything. Almost. Because the truth was, I'd always kept one small piece of the business in my name. Not because I didn't trust him. I told myself it was just for legal safety, a precaution in case of emergencies. But maybe deep down, I knew there might come a day when I'd need that leverage. Maybe I didn't want to admit it, but the part of me that had been burned in life before wasn't willing to put every last coin into someone else's pocket, not even my own blood. I stared at the darkened window, seeing my reflection faintly in the glass. The man staring back looked tired. Yes, but not weak. I'd been through wars, not the kind with guns, but the kind with bills, with long winters, with roofs that leaked when there wasn't enough in the bank to fix them. I'd survived things my son couldn't imagine. And here I was, being told I was too much trouble to call. I wasn't going to beg for his attention. I wasn't going to explain why he was wrong, or why he should remember who put the shirt on his back and the roof over his head. Words weren't going to change this. If words could have fixed it, they would have worked years ago. What I needed now wasn't an argument. It was an action. I thought about the business again, about the competitor down the road who'd always eyed our corner lot with interest. I thought about the lawyer I'd known for 40 years, the man who drew up the very first contracts for that shop. I thought about how fast signatures could be written, how quietly papers could be filed, how suddenly a business could vanish from under someone's feet without a single shout or warning. I sat there for hours, letting the idea take shape in my mind. It didn't make me smile. Revenge rarely does. But it did make something inside me settle, like dust finding its way to the ground after a long time floating in the air. By the time the first thin light of morning started to creep through the curtains, I'd made my decision. I would not call my son again. Not to explain. Not to warn. Not to check in. The next call between us would not be mine. And when it came, because I knew it would be too late. By the time the sun had fully risen, my plan wasn't just a thought. It was a map in my head. Every step was clear. Every name I'd need to call, every paper I'd need to sign, every detail that would have to be airtight. My son thought the business was untouchable now that it had his name on the front door. He thought I had walked away from it entirely, that my role was nothing more than an old man's sentimental attachment. That was his first mistake. When I retired, I didn't just hand over the keys and disappear. I kept a small but crucial stake, 51% voting rights, tucked inside a clause that most people would skim past. It had been my lawyer's suggestion decades ago. Always leave yourself a way back in. I hadn't thought I'd ever use it, but now it was the only thing keeping me from being powerless. I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one I'd kept locked even after retirement. Inside was a thick, weathered folder, old contracts, deeds, tax forms, and one particularly important shareholder agreement. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the black ink still stood sharp. My name, right there, above his, majority owner, final decision maker. I sat there for a while, just running my finger over that signature. It wasn't pride I felt. It was something quieter, the kind of calm that comes when you know you hold the match and the gasoline, and all that's left is to decide if you'll strike it. By 9 a.m., I was dressed in my best suit, not flashy, but the kind that says you're here for business. Dark gray, pressed, with the same tie I'd worn the day we opened the shop. My cane tapped against the hardwood floor as I walked to the front door, a slow and steady rhythm. I locked the house behind me and stepped into the morning air. The law office was just 3 blocks from the shop. I'd walked that route 1,000 times when I was younger, but now every step carried more weight. People on the street nodded, some recognizing me, some just seeing another old man. None of them knew what I was about to do. When I walked into the office, the receptionist looked up, her eyes lighting with recognition. "Mr. Harrington," she said warmly, "it's been too long." "Not long enough," I replied, my voice even. "Is Tom in?" She picked up the phone, and within minutes, my old lawyer, gray-haired now, but still with that sharp glint in his eye, came out to greet me. We shook hands like old soldiers meeting again after a long war. "Didn't think I'd see you back in here," he said as he led me into his office. "Neither did I told him, lowering myself into the chair. "But things change." I laid the shareholder agreement on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and read it over, nodding slowly as if piecing together my thoughts before I even spoke them. "You still have full authority to sell, restructure, or dissolve," he confirmed. "He can't stop it unless you sign that away, which you haven't." "I want it sold," I said plainly. Quietly. Quickly. I don't want him getting wind of it until it's too late. Tom didn't flinch. "Do you have a buyer in mind?" "I know exactly who," I said. "Call Bill Henderson. He's been sniffing around for years." The next hour was spent going through the logistics, valuation, paperwork, transfer of funds. It was all business, no small talk. Every so often, Tom would glance at me, maybe looking for hesitation, but I gave him nothing. The decision had already been made last night in that armchair. Before I left, he said, "You understand this will leave him with nothing?" I met his eyes and replied, "No. It will leave him with exactly what he left me." Silence. Back on the street, the air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but steady, solid. I walked past the shop, not going in, just looking at the front window where my son had replaced my old hand-painted sign with a sleek new one. The gold letters gleamed in the sun, and for a brief moment, I almost remembered the day I'd first put the keys in his hand. The pride, the trust, the hope. Then I kept walking. By the end of the day, Tom had confirmed that Henderson was ready to buy. The offer was more than fair, generous even, and I didn't care if my son thought the price was too low or too high. It wasn't his decision anymore. The sale would be finalized within the week. And I knew, without a doubt, that when the dust settled, the next call from my son wouldn't be a casual check-in. It would be panic, and I would be ready. The thing about revenge is, it works best in silence. No warnings, no confrontations, no raised voices. Just the sound of quiet paperwork being signed in a sunlit office while the other person still thinks the world is steady beneath their feet. 3 days after that meeting with Tom, everything was in motion. Henderson's legal team had drawn up the purchase agreement. The bank was preparing the transfer. The company's assets were already being evaluated and cataloged, and every step of it was happening behind closed doors. My son went about his week thinking he was in control, that the business was humming along under his steady hand. He didn't know that control had already slipped through his fingers. I didn't go anywhere near the shop. I didn't call him. I didn't so much as walk down that street again. I wanted him comfortable, maybe even a little cocky. That's when the fall hurts most. On the morning of the signing, I was up before the alarm. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you can feel in your bones. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. I thought about all the mornings I'd started this same way, before the shop opened, before the first customer walked through the door, when I believed I was building something for my family's future. Now I was dismantling it with the same steady hands. I dressed sharply again, the same suit, the same tie, not out of vanity, but because moments like this deserve a certain kind of respect. Respect for the work it took to get here. Respect for the finality of what was about to happen. The law office smelled faintly of lemon polish when I walked in. Tom was already there, the documents neatly stacked on his desk. Henderson sat opposite him, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert. He was a businessman through and through. He knew a good deal when he saw one, and he wasn't about to ask questions about why I was selling. We went through every page. I initialed where I needed to, signed where I had to, and with each stroke of the pen, a little more of the weight I'd been carrying slid off my shoulders. The sale price, an exact, substantial figure, was agreed upon. The funds were to be wired into my personal account before the end of the day. When it was done, Henderson reached across the table and shook my hand. "You built something solid," he said. "I'll take good care of it." I didn't reply. His care for it was none of my concern. My concern was that it was no longer my son's. Tom slid the final folder toward me, the one confirming the change of ownership had been filed with the state. It was official. As of that moment, my son was no longer the owner of the business he'd taken for granted. He didn't even know it yet. Walking out of the office, I felt no thrill, no rush of triumph, just a deep, still quiet inside me. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always burn hot. Sometimes it settles in cold, like the slow freeze of winter. By the time I got home, the wire transfer had already hit my account. I sat down at my desk, opened the bank statement, and saw the numbers sitting there, solid and undeniable. That was the moment I knew there was no turning back. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the old photograph of the shop's opening day. My son standing beside me, beaming, his arm slung over my shoulder. For a second, I almost felt something twist in my chest. Almost. But then I remembered his voice on the phone a week earlier. Stop calling. Cold. Final. Like I was nothing. That memory steadied me. From that point on, my only task was to wait. Henderson would take possession immediately, his team stepping in to oversee operations. My son would walk into the shop one morning expecting another day of business as usual, and instead, he'd find strangers at his desk, paperwork on the counter, and no trace of his authority left. And when that moment came, when the panic set in and he reached for his phone, I'd be ready to answer. Not to explain, not to comfort, just to make sure he understood exactly what it feels like when someone you trust decides you're not worth their time. The trigger had been pulled. The shot was already in motion. All that was left was to hear it land. It didn't take long, exactly 7 days after that last conversation, the one where he told me to stop calling. The phone rang, not just once, but over and over. 5 missed calls in the space of an hour. Same number each time, my son's. The first time it rang, I was sitting in my armchair by the window, sipping tea and watching the rain slide down the glass. I let it buzz until it went silent. The second time, I set the phone face down on the coffee table and listened to the muffled vibrations. The third time, I picked it up, just to see his name on the screen, and then set it back down without answering. By the fourth call, I knew the panic was setting in. By the fifth, I decided to answer. His voice was different now, tight, frantic, with that edge people get when the ground has just dropped out from under them. Dad, what happened? He burst out before I could say a word. I got to the shop this morning and there were people there, lawyers. They said the business isn't mine anymore. They said... His words tumbled over each other, breaking apart into ragged breaths. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask how he was feeling. I let him keep talking because I wanted to hear it all. The confusion, the desperation, the dawning realization that something irreversible had happened while he wasn't paying attention. He kept going. You can't do this to me. This is my livelihood, my only income. How am I supposed to... Dad, please. His voice cracked, the way it used to when he was a boy and didn't get his way. Only this time, he wasn't asking for a toy or extra dessert. He was asking for the life I had just taken from him. I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch for a moment. I could almost see him pacing, running a hand through his hair, staring at the paperwork he didn't understand. Finally, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, almost quiet enough to make him lean into the phone to hear me. I thought, I said slowly, you didn't want me calling. There was nothing on the other end for a second, just breathing. Then a stammered, What does that have to... Dad, I didn't mean... But I had already pulled the phone away from my ear. My thumb hovered for a second over the red button, and then I pressed it. Call ended. No goodbye. No promise to talk later. The room was silent again. Only the rain against the glass and the ticking of the old clock in the corner. I set the phone down, turned it over so I couldn't see the screen, and went back to my tea. I didn't check for more calls that day. I didn't need to. The sound of his voice, shaken, pleading, was still echoing in my mind, and for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. After I hung up, the phone lit up again within seconds. Call after call, 15 in a row. I didn't answer a single one. I sat there in my armchair, letting the vibrations rattle the table, the sound filling the quiet room like a swarm of trapped insects. Eventually, the calls stopped. For a while, then came the messages, short at first, then longer, messier. Dad, we need to talk. Please, just call me back. I didn't mean what I said. I was stressed. I need you right now. I read none of them. I only saw the previews flash across the screen before they disappeared. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply done. A day passed, then two. On the third day, I answered one of his calls. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to make sure my final words would leave no room for misunderstanding. When I picked up, his voice burst through the speaker like water through a cracked dam. "Dad! Thank God! Listen, I was wrong, okay? I messed up. I didn't mean to say that. You know I didn't mean it. We can fix this. We can figure something out. You just have to—" I waited until his sentence broke into stammering. Then I spoke. "I gave you everything I had," I said slowly, my voice low and steady. "And you told me to stop calling. So I stopped." Silence. No breath. No reply. Just that dead, empty pause that follows when someone finally understands the truth and realizes there's nothing they can say to change it. Then I hung up. And that was the last time I ever heard his voice. The days that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet I used to think was lonely, but now felt like peace. I didn't wait for his calls anymore, and I didn't dread them either. I canceled the line he always used to reach me, changed my number, and made sure no one in the family had it except the few who still knew how to knock on a door before they asked for something. I moved my chair closer to the window, where the light came in warm every morning, and I started planting again. Tomatoes, peppers, a row of marigolds just for color. I'd wake early, water them, and sit with my coffee as the sun rose over the fence. I thought about the shop sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a strange fondness, like an old friend I'd lost touch with. The key still sits on my desk, right where I put it the day I walked away. Some days, I pick it up, turn it in my hand, feel the weight of it, the cool metal against my skin. It reminds me that I built something from nothing, twice. Once in business, once in family. One succeeded. The other didn't. I don't hate my son. Hate is heavy, and I've carried enough weight in my lifetime. But I will never let him close enough to wound me again. Love, I learned, is given freely. But respect, that must be earned, and he stopped earning it the moment he told me to stop calling.